and then move on to the formal introduction from there, and we'll just roll right into it. I should caution you too that because of the way Tara has to end this event, it will feel like you're just being chopped off. You know, like when Tara ends it, everybody's kicked out all at once. So don't take it as rude. We're not throwing you out anything, but it will feel extremely abrupt when it ends.
Yep. That will be familiar.
It's still unsettling to me when that happens, sometimes mid-sentence. You know, so. All right, it's 7:01, Terry. You can start letting people in from the waiting room if you're ready. We've already got 50 people here, which is great. For a spring day, it's beautiful here, so a lot of people are going to want to be outside. Here they all come. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Good evening, everybody. My name is Sean Latham. I'm the director of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. I'll ask you to bear with us for just a moment while we bring everyone in from the waiting room. This process will take just a few moments, so we'll ask you to be patient with us while we bring you in from our digital waiting room, and we'll be turning off your cameras and your microphones as you arrive. So I'll ask you to just be patient here for a moment while we bring tonight's crowd in. We have a terrific turnout for the evening. I think there are already 55, 56 people in the waiting room here. So it's going to be a really exciting discussion tonight. We're delighted that you can join us. It's a pleasure to have you here on what I hope is for many of you a beautiful spring day wherever you happen to be. I'll ask you to bear with us here for just one more moment while we continue to welcome people in from the waiting room and get as you come in, we'll be turning off your cameras and turning off your video, your cameras as well as your audio, and muting you just to make sure the focus stays on the speaker for the first part of tonight's session. Toward the latter part of the event, we will welcome the opportunity for you guys to turn your cameras on as well. This is something we started to experiment with recently, and we've had terrific response. It's just nice to see that for our speakers, and I hope for you, that it's not just a collection of white names on black backgrounds that are sitting in this room, but a collection of human beings that are gathering together from all over the place to come and hear tonight's talk. All right, we're still welcoming in a few more people from the waiting room, so I'll ask you to bear with us patiently for just one or two more moments. We do welcome you as you come in. If you would like to go ahead and if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you'll find the chat feature. If you click on chat, it will open the chat feature that we're using on the side. We'll be using this throughout the evening, and I'll say more about that in a moment. You can also see all the participants if you click on the participants tab as well. So you're certainly welcome to do that, and you'll get a sense of the community that we're gathering together for this evening's event. One of the great challenges, of course, of running a humanities center in the age of COVID is doing so without humans in the room. And so it's just a real pleasure that we're able to bring this group together this evening. And it's a great pleasure for my part to be able to welcome you here. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started. We're continuing to bring people in, which is phenomenal. It means we have a great turnout. It's great to have you here. As I said at the outset, my name is Sean Latham. I'm the Pauline McFarland Walter Professor of English at the University of Tulsa and the director of the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities, which is the host for this evening's event. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you here virtually to the University of Tulsa and to the Humanities Center. I do wish, of course, that we were able to conduct this event in person and that we could be welcoming many of you to our beautiful facilities at the University of Tulsa's campus in Tyrrell Hall, where, as many of you know, we have a phenomenal lecture hall that's able to accommodate events like this. So I'm grateful that you're willing to take the time to join us on your computers and amid your busy lives and join us virtually this evening. Before we get going, I want to say just a few words about the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities and about our mission and the work that we do. And really, we have a twofold mission. First, we work to serve as a think tank here on campus, and we do so by bringing together a group of research fellows that involve University of Tulsa faculty members, University of Tulsa students, and then members of the larger community that we bring together through a challenging application process. And this group comes together and they work on ideas and challenges and problems in our communities that we think can only be fully and richly addressed using the distinctive tools of the arts and humanities. Throughout the academic year of 2020-2021, we've been working on the interlinked themes of courage and rage. Both of these felt like important ways to respond to the situation of COVID, to the situation of American politics when we put these themes together. And locally, we had a very particular interest in this set of themes since they connected to important responses to the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre, the centenary of which is approaching here in just a few months. So in addition to bringing together this group of research fellows that does intensive research throughout the entire year on these topics, we also try to host between 30 and 35 public programs every year. These programs take a variety of different forms. In a normal kind of year, we'll host dramatic performances, concerts, art exhibitions, community-wide conversations, and more. Throughout this COVID era, we've obviously been focusing primarily on digital events like this that we can deliver in this kind of accessible format. We have just a few more events coming up throughout the course of this year, and I'll urge you to learn more about them by visiting us at humanities.utulsa.edu, where you can find a complete calendar of the events that remain for this year. And I'll call your attention to just a few. We have Professor Melissa Homestead, who will be joining us in a couple of weeks to talk about biography. And we also, in a sort of interlinked event that we're doing with the University of Tulsa Institute for Bob Dylan Studies, in just 2 months, we'll be celebrating Bob Dylan's 80th birthday. You may know that Bob Dylan's papers are actually located here in Tulsa, and we've put together a 3-day symposium that will focus on Dylan's context, his music, and what it might mean for the future. You'll find a link in chat there that'll take you to our calendar and give you a sense of many more of the events that we're doing. I should also note that we've already settled on our theme for next year and are beginning to solicit faculty and student and public fellows applications. And that theme is recovery and renewal. It clearly speaks to our post-COVID moment about what it means to build back, and to borrow a popular political phrase, what it might mean to build back differently. What have we learned during this period of extended quarantine, and what have we learned? What do we want to take away from this, and what do we want to recover that we might have lost? So if you're interested in those kinds of questions, and particularly in the way in which the arts and humanities speak to that challenging question right now, I'd urge you to visit our website, again, at humanities.utulsa.edu, and there you'll find information about the theme, as well as information on how to apply to be one of our public faculty or student fellows. I now get to do, and I'm very happy to pivot here. Oh, I should say one thing before we get going. I do want to say that if you've joined us for any Humanities Center events in the past, you'll know that one of the things that we've found to be really helpful is to take just a moment here at the very beginning to invite you to take a moment and just say something in the chat. We'd love to have you introduce yourself, tell us who you are, where you're from, what might have brought you to tonight's event, what you find interesting about it. It just, again, gives you the sense of a human connection, that we're not just these black boxes that are hovering on a screen, but actual people with actual sort of ideas and concerns and questions. So I want to invite you to just introduce yourself here right at the beginning in the chat box. Tell us where you're coming from. And at the same time, I want to also encourage you to ask questions and make comments throughout the talk. One of the things that's actually very useful we found about conducting virtual events like this in the Zoom format is, unlike in a traditional lecture, you don't have to hold your questions till the end. When you have an idea or a question or a comment or something comes to you, please just post it in the text box when it occurs. We have all kinds of interesting conversations that will sometimes happen in the chat alongside the lecture. You can, of course, turn it off if you don't want to follow along, but it also gives you a way to create a greater sense of connection and conversation. So we urge you to join us in participating there as well. We have several assistants here at the Humanities Center who will be monitoring the chat and gathering up questions to make sure that we capture them all at the end of this evening's event. So now I get to do something that I've actually wanted to do for many years, and that's to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Utka to the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. I've known her and her work for the better part of 2 decades now, and she is, simply put, one of the most creative and astute critics of modern literature that I know. And this happens to be my field, so I know lots of people, and so you'll have to trust me when I say Dr. Utka is one of the best, and we're very fortunate to have her here this evening. In what can only be a testament to the sharpness of her critical instincts, she published in 2019 a book called Viral Modernism, about the ways in which the 1918 influenza pandemic helped reshape our literature, art, and culture. That epidemic, of course, killed many people. And I actually had the very specific numbers here, but Elizabeth is going to talk about those, so I'm actually not going to say anything quite yet about those exact numbers. But that epidemic was devastating. Far more devastating than the World War that had preceded it. And I think we still are trying to take a measure of how to compare the sort of scale of death of the 1918 pandemic to the one that we're experiencing now. In Viral Modernism, Utka artfully and brilliantly traces the consequences of this devastation, locating it in everything from the revival of seances to the rise of literary experimentation we associate with modernism, and even the invention of the zombie film. It was a deathly era, and Dr. Utke takes us through it in a work that blends history, medicine, and cultural criticism in rich and fascinating ways. And it's a book that now seems to me even more timely with each passing day, as we begin to emerge from our own devastating pandemic and begin to count its toll, to assess how it has changed us, and to imagine a future that will inevitably be defined by our own prolonged mourning for all the people and all the experiences we have lost. Dr. Utke now serves as professor of English at the University of Richmond, where she has won a series of awards that recognize her talents as both a researcher and a teacher. She's written over a dozen articles on topics in modern literature and culture, ranging from consumer culture to germ theory and trauma. So she is also the author of Consuming Traditions, an investigation of how art and artists came to value the idea of the authentic. It is a genuine pleasure to welcome her here to this virtual event at the Oklahoma Center for the Humanities. So I hope you'll join me with at least your virtual digital applause as we bring her into the room this evening. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Oh, thank you so much, Sean. That was a lovely introduction. I have put in the chat a way to participate in the talk polls. I have done something that really I would urge you as a professor not to do, which is to try out a new polling app and embedding videos before a talk. But I'm going to try it and we'll see how it goes. So to participate in these talk polls, you can either use your computer and go to the link that I've put there in the chat, or, and I think this is probably easier, is from your phone. So you can stay on your computer, but from your phone, if you text to 37607 there, and you text that text, Elizabeth out 799, you will be able to, when the poll comes up, you'll be able to vote in the poll. So it's a real pleasure to be here. And I'm actually going to start with a poll. So, I don't know how much time you would need to get that going. So I'm going to start. And if there's not a lot of people who participate, I will know that you will need more time. Okay. All right, so my talk, and I'm going to be going back and forth between the screen and just the talking head here. So bear with me as I do that. All right, starting with an easy question. Have you heard of World War I? And I'll give people maybe 15 seconds for each of these questions. And this is entirely anonymous, so do not worry. Your yes or your no will not show up with your name on it. This poll I'm trying out is allows you to do it in the PowerPoint, which I did not know until today that it was even possible to do such a thing. And Sean, if you will let me know if there's anything in the chat that that is going wrong with the technology, just please let me know.
Sure, we'll keep an eye on it. I was just able to answer, so far
Great.
so good. I was using my web browser.
Great. All right, look, we're going to, more people will join. I have already a lot of answers here coming in, but we're going to go ahead and just view those. All right, where? All right. Not surprisingly, the answer to for most people to this one is yes. All right. Before the COVID pandemic, Had you heard of the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919? No, yes, maybe, kind of. You sort of had heard of it. Maybe your grandmother mentioned it, grandfather, weren't sure. Maybe you read over it. We're going to see. All right, so most of you had. I'm very impressed. When I was giving talks on this before the COVID pandemic, almost everyone sort of had not heard of it or had not heard how bad it had been. So so kudos to all of you. All right, roughly how many soldiers died in World War I on all sides of the conflict? Just taking a guess, 2.75 million, 9 to 11 million, 50 to 100 million. All right. Answers are coming in even faster for these. Let's take a look at what people know. All right, so these are more evenly divided, 2.75 million, 9.11 million, 50 to 100 million. All right, let's go to this. How many people died globally in the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919? Take a guess on this one. 2.75 million, 9 to 11 million, 50 to 100 million. I'm always sort of amazed when technology works. All right, well done, people. All right, also range of guesses here. Between these three, I will reveal the answers in a moment. And then our last is how many people have died worldwide so far of COVID-19? Knowing as we do, these numbers are hard to keep track of. All right, also a range of answers here. Let me stop sharing for now. All right, so embedded in the answers to these questions is really the push for me of this research. So before COVID and before, say, let me start again. In the roughly 2 decades I spent studying and teaching modernism, which is my specialty. That's early 20th century literature of World War I. I'd heard of the influenza pandemic sort of tangentially, but I hadn't ever really focused on it. For modernism, really the main sort of big trauma we focus on is World War I. And so I was really trained to read for World War I. I taught all sorts of classes about World War I and wrote about World War I. And then I started to learn about the influenza pandemic, and it brought up a huge mystery to me. And it was this mystery that really started my research. The influenza pandemic kills between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. And a lot of scientists feel like the 100 million mark is not nearly high enough. Right? It's an unprecedented number of people dying in a pandemic in a concentrated period of time, 50 to 100 million people globally. And in World War I mean, you get a lot of different numbers, but 9 to 11 million soldiers dying in World War I. So what I wanted to know is, where did it go, right? How could I have spent all of this time studying the literature of this period without knowing more about this pandemic and how devastating it was. Why do we not talk about it in modernist studies? Why did it not show up in the literature? I couldn't, this is not the way literature and art and the humanities work, right? Art is one of the primary ways that we are able to process the worst things that have happened to us, the best things that have happened to us, but major traumas, right? You cannot kill 50 to 100 million people, mainly in a 4-month period, right? Without it having an impact in the literature and in the culture. So my project began as a sort of search, like where did it go? And like most obsessions, it started to show up everywhere when I started to know what to look for. So I will leave for the question and answer one of the mysteries, which is why did it disappear from cultural memory? I mean, we are hearing a lot more about it now, but why did it disappear from cultural memory? And it's sort of a perfect storm of silence. It's not just one reason, but I'm going to leave that for the question and answer. And here, what I'm going to do is talk about where it went and in the aftermath, because that's where we are hopefully headed here with COVID. The COVID death numbers are 2.75 million. That was the answer to that. So let me give you a map now. Going back here. A map of the talk. So I'm going to talk briefly about what happened to the bodies in World War I. And then I'm going to quickly turn to bodies in the pandemic. What happened to bodies during the influenza pandemic of 1918. And to do this, I'm going to need to give you at least a brief history, a brief look at the numbers, and a sense of the symptoms. What did it look like? Because in literature and in popular culture, how it shows up is we need to know the sensory and emotional history of the pandemic, not just the numbers, in order to recognize where it's showing up in the culture. Because these two mass death events together produce this enormous body problem. And so you have, between the war and the pandemic, something in the neighborhood of 110 million corpses, most of them insecurely buried, or many of them insecurely buried, and many without any sort of mourning ritual associated with them. And this does have enormous impacts. And I'm going to look at 3 sort of different areas. I'm going to look at T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, and then talk about seances and spirit photography and spiritualism, and then proto-zombies. And my example is going to be H.P. Lovecraft. All right. So let's first talk pretty briefly about bodies and World War I, since most people are at least somewhat familiar with with World War I and some of the conditions that that war saw. So we have these 9 to 11 million deaths, and that does not include civilian deaths, which puts the numbers much higher. This was artillery warfare. You have a whole bunch of young men going off to war thinking it is going to be a war fought with sort of cavalry and bayonets and hand-to-hand combat and heroic sacrifice. And that's obviously not anything like what artillery warfare is like. You have appalling conditions in the trenches. You have soldiers drowning, certainly at sea, but also in trenches from the massive amounts of rain and mud. You have poison gas. You have disease, and you have an enormous number, a simply astonishing number of missing soldiers, right? Where there was simply not enough left of the bodies in order to identify or bury them. And even when there were burial rituals were suspended, soldiers buried in mass graves, soldiers never recovered. I mean, they're still recovering soldiers every year who died in World War I in the fields and throughout the two fronts of the war. So, and for the 8 to 11 million dead, right, you have so many more than that who are mourning, right? Mourning people who simply seem to disappear. Right, alongside this, we have the bodies of the influenza pandemic. Here we have 50 to 100 million people dead, and also 500 million people infected. And I think that's important because not only did you have all of these bodies and all of the problems that and the mourning that they represented, but so many people living with the aftermath of this this really unusual flu. This was not an ordinary flu. The United States loses more people in the influenza pandemic than we lost in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq combined. It came in 3 waves. The first wave came in the spring and summer of 1918. And this wave was deadly. I mean, it was certainly deadly, but it was comparatively mild. 5,000 British soldiers died. People did call it the Spanish influenza because they thought it had originated in Spain. It did not. We're not sure where it originated. We used to think it was Kansas. Now there's speculation that it's any number of other places. Scientists actually have not quite figured it out. But one thing we do know is it did not originate in Spain. Spain seemed to report its cases earlier because it had less press censorship during the war, and so that may be how it got its name. But it's actually probably a good idea not to refer to it as the Spanish flu, since it did not originate in Spain. So doctors, even in this first wave, were noticing one really ominous sign, and that is that this was a flu that attacked healthy young adults and killed them in extremely high numbers. So if you know anything about the flu, you know that it usually it is deadly, and it usually kills the very young and the very old, but not healthy young adults. Not this flu. This flu did kill the very young, not so much the very old, but healthy young adults in extraordinarily high numbers, pregnant women in numbers that are terrifying, and it did seem like the healthier you were, the more likely you were to die. And there was various reasons for that, which again, we can talk about in the chat. It was the second wave, though, that came between September and December of 1918 that killed millions and millions and millions all across the world. It erupts at the same time in 3 port cities, Boston, Mass, Brest, France, and Sierra Leone. And people were, the world was flooded, right? Flooded with this flu. As one doctor reported, the men on the front were dropping who were dropping like flies were worse than any sight that they had ever seen in France after a battle. And this is not just this is a sentiment echoed over and over and over and over again, right? It was, no one had ever seen anything like this in memory. It was swift. All over the world, newspapers are reporting on people just dropping in the streets, and it was sort of potentially one of the worst 4 months in human history in terms of sheer death. There was another wave, a third wave, between January and May of 1919, and then it disappeared. So let's look at some of the symptoms. So it did come with cough, fever, aches, the kind of thing that if you've had the flu, you know about them. But the cough was bad enough to rip muscles and to rip cartilage. It had the most vicious type of pneumonia, one doctor said, that has ever been seen. The lungs in the autopsies, they were indistinguishable from soldiers who had died from poison gas. There were floods of bleeding. This is one of the most widely reported symptoms. Floods of bleeding from the nose and the mouth and the ears. This wasn't the decorous bleeding that you saw on if you watched Downton Abbey. This was really astonishing. Here's one letter from a flu survivor. Blood would shoot out as though kept under high pressure and spray to the end of the bed, and this happened about 30 times a day. And this is a very common report. Delirium was from the high fevers was extremely common, and that delirium could come with rages and violence. Again, you have so many reports of patients just racing around the hospitals with knives and razor blades, and it disrupted behavior. The skin would turn a dark blue or purple just before death. It also caused lingering damage, long influenza, if you will, damage to the lung, permanent damage to the lungs, permanent damage to the heart, to the nervous system. It could cause a range of mental health issues, including lingering depression, and then this profound exhaustion that could go on for months and months and months and months and months. People lost all their hair, they lost their hearing, their hair turned white. It was just a range of very, very strange set of symptoms. So much so that people really didn't think it was the flu. Even when doctors said, no, really, it's the flu, people thought it was the bubonic plague, or they thought it was some sort of new virus. It was, in Ireland, they called it the black flu, right? It was just, it was not like the flu that most of us know. Much like today, life was visibly changed. People were wearing masks. Everything was closed. There were emergency hospitals that were opened. There was no vaccine. However, they had not even, there was no vaccine that worked. They had not actually seen they thought it was a bacterium. The flu is a virus, and they didn't have the electron microscope, so viruses hadn't actually been discovered yet, though they did have the term. And so everything grinds to a halt for less time than in COVID, but many of the scenes that you see from the influenza pandemic are really echoed in the scenes that we see today. All right, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. We'll go back. So 1920s, you have 110 million corpses, probably more. You have many, many more than that in terms of people who are mourning or recovering from war wounds and the sort of lingering effects of influenza. You have a widespread sense that the burial of your loved one was not secure, right? Either there's no grave that you can go to, or they were buried in a mass grave, or they are missing, or there was not enough coffins, or you had to bury a relative in the backyard. And there isn't that sense of closure, right? There isn't that sense of mourning rituals that have helped people through this terrible event, right? Now, there are some funerals for sure, right? There's some funerals in the war, and there's a whole sort of bunch of memorialization that goes on for the war dead, not for the influenza dead, but for the war dead. but people are left, right, wondering. You have almost everybody in the world mourning somebody, and a lot of people in the world also dealing with the after effects of either the war or influenza or both. Right, so there's this widespread sense of living death, and this sort of haunting sense that the dead are close, but you're not exactly sure where they are. So one of the things that I noticed showing up in the literature and in the culture was this obsession with resurrection, right? This obsession with what happens after we die. Now, granted, at any time in human history, you can see an obsession with resurrection and an obsession with what happens after we die. But this was a real surge, and I think some people. Well, this brings us to the three examples. The T.S. Eliot, because we see a lot of this show up in the culture. T.S. Eliot and then seances and then zombies. All right, so I'm going to go back to my screen. All right, here are some pictures from the aftermath of the influenza pandemic. In Philadelphia, these are grave diggers who are digging mass graves for flu victims. Here is another picture, different mass graves. It's not the best images, but here are just sort of piles of bodies. And when you go through the flu sort of documents, you see this all over the world, right? Reports of bodies just stacked, often said like stacked like cordwood. And so this is what people are sort of seeing everywhere. You know, in Philadelphia, they have wagons going through the street with priests, you know, saying, "Bring out your dead," right? It's a really apocalyptic. It's an apocalyptic scene. All right, so let's go for a moment to T.S. Eliot, and I know that seances and zombies are. I mean, I love poetry, but seances and zombies are really interesting. So I'm not going to spend as much time as I might on T.S. Eliot. But most of us, most of you have read probably The Wasteland in high school or in college. A notoriously difficult poem. T.S. Eliot did not go to war in World War I, but he and his wife did catch the influenza pandemic. The influenza virus during the pandemic. They both had pretty mild cases. Eliot was really haunted that his mind had been affected by his case, which was not impossible. And his first wife, Vivian, was sort of tormented by nightmares in the aftermath of her case, and Eliot talks about this in his letters, and he starts to kind of think of influenza as a sort of broader symptom of malaise, right? He talks about this domestic influenza that is pervading his household. It's a very unhappy marriage, both of them in extremely poor health. He shortly after suffers a kind of nervous breakdown and goes off and writes The Wasteland. Now, a lot of The Wasteland has been interpreted in thousands of different ways, almost all of which are correct, right? It's a great poem, and it means many more than one thing, right? There's not one key to a great poem, and but typically The Wasteland is read through the lens of the war. I mean, through many, many lenses, but that the war is everywhere in the poem. Eliot himself denied this. He said, no, it wasn't about the war. It was my own personal grumblings. But it is very much kind of comes out of an atmosphere of war. But what's hidden is that it also comes out of an atmosphere of pandemic. So some of these lines start to read extremely differently. Burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out. O Lord, thou pluckest, burning. This is a direct quotation from The Wasteland, a famously fragmented poem. And this, you can, if you look at the footnotes, it can be linked to a range of different sources. But it also reads very much like somebody in delirium, somebody with a high fever, somebody who is whose thoughts and body feel fragmented, right? It's and it's something that's immediate, right? Something that is ongoing that we see in these burning, 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 burning. You can kind of feel a sense of delirium coming over the poem. And not just the kind of, he doesn't just give us the acute phases of illness. We also get some of the aftermath. So another very famous passage, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many. I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet flowed up the hill and down King William Street. So this is not on a battlefield. This is in the middle of London. And there is this sense, right, as you walk around London, as you can see, of death, right? Death everywhere, a sense of a kind of haunted landscape. And when I think about going out after COVID, right, when I get my second vaccine, there's this sense that of loss, right, and of a sense of a sort of ghostly presence, right, and a sense that the people who are still alive, right, all of us, are changed, right, are sort of in some kind of nebulous limbo, a kind of living death state where we don't exactly always know the time or the place, and we feel unmoored, and we have that sense here. Here's another. I think I need to move this. Another very famous passage. There I saw one I knew and stopped him, crying, "Stetson, you who were with me in the ships at Malai, that corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disrupted its bed? Oh, keep the dog far hence that's fed to man, or with his nails he'll dig it up again." This sense, we have this sense of war here, but also a sense that there are bodies that are insecurely buried, as there were everywhere at this time, and this sense of that's here and throughout the poem of a kind of deathly fecundity, right? A deathly blossoming. This is April being the cruelest month because, and this is the way that a flu virus moves. This is the way COVID moves, right? It moves by replicating itself, by being unbelievably productive, as it were, and a sense that that this kind of fecundity is not bringing birth or a kind of renewal, but a kind of death, and a death that's very close, domestic, in the garden, and with a corpse that could come back anytime, as of course the influenza virus could come back anytime. All right. I want to move now to sort of two ends of a resurrection continuum. So you have kind of high modernism with Eliot and a sort of sense of a sort of living death kind of feel. But in Seances and Zombies of the 1920s, we have a sort of, on the one hand, a sense of hopeful resurrection. Right? And these are both ways that people found, in popular culture to handle that kind of loss, right? And I think this is something that we're going to have to face, and we have to face now, and we're going to have to face in the next, probably the next decade. How do we come to terms with mass death, right? How do we come to terms with the amount of loss and pain and grief? And these were sort of two big solutions in the popular culture at two ends of the kind of resurrection continuum. You have a hopeful end, right? Maybe the dead would come back with good news, right? Seances, spiritualism, spirit photography, it was all sort of good news on the good news end, right? That your loved one could come back, having not been able to say goodbye, right? Could come back and give you a sign, right? Give you some kind of sign. And I'll explain what spiritualism is and spirit photography is in just a moment. On the other end of the resurrection continuum in the 1920s, you start to get these proto-zombie figures, right? And here, the dead are coming back, but it's bad news, right? It's coming back and they're out for blood. And it's really, really a dangerous thing. And it would be better if they stayed in their graves. Okay, so to start our discussion of seances and spiritualism, this is a different kind of poll, but in one or two words, what is ectoplasm? And you can also just give me some adjectives, right, on what do you associate ectoplasm with, right? What does it bring to mind? Or what is it? I'll give you a minute to think about ectoplasm. Okay, you know what? It may have been locked. So if you tried, go ahead and try again. Yeah, there we go. All right. Let's take a look. Oh, great. Well done, people. Yes, slime, spirit, energy, physical, substance. Yes, manifestation, great, decaying, gauze-like, wonderful. Proof, yes, residue, spiritualist, kryptonite. Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Yes, slime. It's impossible not to think of Ghostbusters, right? All right. So a couple of sort of key terms in spiritualism. So spiritualism did not arrive in the 1920s. And so I just want to be, if I have any historians of spiritualism out there, I do not want to get in trouble. It's a spiritual, I mean, people have often, have long, for thousands of years, right, been interested in ghosts and resurrection and what happens after you die. But spiritualism as a movement starts in mid-19th century United States as a movement with with the Fox sisters, right, who say that they're communicating with somebody from the other side, a ghost from the other side who communicates by rapping, right? And then this sort of exploded. The interest in seances and spiritualism exploded. You have all of these seances across the globe with supposedly ghosts coming back and tilting tables and tapping people on the shoulder and speaking through mediums. And so this is all going on in in the mid-19th century. You have this sort of ectoplasm, right, which would appear mediums would sort of ectoplasm would come out of various bodily orifices, or your lost loved one would sort of appear in an ectoplasmic sort of form to be able to tap you on the shoulder, right, or play a musical instrument. And we also have spirit photography, where in photographs, one of your relatives would appear as a ghostly presence in the photograph. Right now, to our eyes, these look like obvious hoaxes, but you can imagine how unbelievably comforting, right, this would be, right, to have a photograph where your loved one is right at your shoulder, right, looking over you, right there, right. This is something that anyone who's experienced a loss, I think, can deeply understand. So after the war and after the influenza pandemic, the interest in seances, ectoplasm, and spirit photography had sort of died out, but the interest comes roaring back. People are suddenly flocking to mediums, to get messages from their lost loved ones, to spirit photographers. The Sorbonne in France is studying seriously studying ectoplasm. Right, if you go to the Cambridge Library, has a box of ectoplasm in their archives. I confess I sat with it on the table next to me. I did call it up from the archives when I was doing research for this book, but I didn't. It was oozing. I didn't actually open it. Maybe I should have. But we have a familiar figure here, Arthur Conan Doyle. And he was the writer of the Sherlock Holmes mysteries. As a lot of you probably know, he was also extremely interested in spiritualism. This started before the war and the pandemic, but he became its primary spokesman after the war. He is widely reported to have lost his brother-in-law, and his son Kingsley in the war, and that's a picture of Kingsley. But this is in fact incorrect. He did lose his brother and his brother-in-law in the war, but his son survived the war and came back, and he died of being young and healthy. He died of the influenza pandemic. Doyle, who was a writer but also a doctor, was not able to do anything to save his son, and he started to give tours. Right, he was giving sold-out tours to Carnegie Hall, and across across the globe on spiritualism and on spirit photography. And he was working with one of the most famous spirit photographers, Ada Dean. And he would go, and he felt he had communicated with his son in all of these seances and in these spirit photographs. And so he was sort of getting the news out. And at Carnegie Hall, he was showing. The quality of the picture has degraded over the years, but this first picture on the right is the cenotaph, one of the main memorials to World War I, and he's putting up these photos at Carnegie Hall, projecting them. And in the first photo, it's there you can sort of see a cloud, and in the second photo, again, the quality is not very good, but you can see the heads. You can sort of slightly see the heads here of, he said, sort of the dead who had sort of come back to help comfort the mourners at this memorial. Here is another photo by Ada Dean, also supposedly at the cenotaph, and here you can see see the heads a little bit more. Again, to our eyes, sort of obvious kind of photo doctoring, but but enormously comforting. You read the newspaper reports of people who were at Carnegie Hall, written by, in one that I read, this sort of hard-bitten journalist who was like, this is a complete, fraud. But he was like, look, this was eerie. This was unbelievable. When he put these photos up, people fainted, collapsed, screamed, right? And he also included photos of his son, who was dead from the flu. So it was a sort of combination of these sort of war and flu survivors who were still mourning those who had died. Here, here's a medium who is expelling ectoplasm through her nose, supposedly. And here the central figure here is none other than our friend Arthur Conan Doyle. This was taken after he died. Does bear a remarkable resemblance to photos that are out there, but the ectoplasm was supposedly forming into his shape. All right, so I'm going to play just a tiny bit of a clip. This is the only recording we have of Arthur Conan Doyle. And he's speaking in this video. It's just about a minute and a half. And he's speaking in this video. And actually, what I may need to do, I'm going to go out. I'm going to stop the share and go back in again because I need to share the sound. Great. And here he's speaking about why he is so interested in spiritualism and all of the letters he got from all around the world, from people who were talking about how comforting it was. And here he's talking about young men in the war, but he's also thinking about his son, who and so many others who have died in the pandemic. And I'm going to have to skip. I have it lined up, but it may not start where I want it to. Let's see. Nope.
Gradually, I became more and more convinced on the matter as I studied year in, year out. But it was only in the time of the war, when all these splendid young fellows were disappearing from our view, the whole world was saying, well, what's become of them? Where are they? What are they doing now? Have they dissipated into nothing? Or are they still the grand fellows that we used to know? It was only at that time that I realized the overpowering importance to the human race of knowing more about this matter. Then it was that I flung myself more earnestly into it, and that I felt the highest purpose that I could possibly devote the remainder of my life to was trying to bring across to other people something of that knowledge and assurance which I had acquired myself. Certainly the results have justified me. I'm quite sure I could fill a room of my house with the letters that I've received from people telling me of the consolation which my writings on this subject and my lectures on this subject have given to them. How they have once more heard the sound of a vanished voice and felt the touch of the vanished hand.
So it's easy to, I think, roll your eyes at spirit photography or a scientist like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle who created Sherlock Holmes, and say, it's obviously fraud. And absolutely, a lot of mediums were fraudulent. I think from my research, it does suggest to me that Arthur Conan Doyle genuinely believed that this was true, and he genuinely brought some kind of consolation in a time where consolation consolation was extremely difficult to find. And you'll note here that he talks about the war, and often people would lie when their relatives had died in the influenza pandemic and said that they had died in the war, because it was easier to frame, it was easier to understand than a familiar virus, right? To be carried off by the influenza virus was seen as a kind of weakness. But this was enormously helpful in a time when bodies had produced all of these sorts of floods of terrible fluids, at a time when bodies were missing, when there was this sort of terrible sort of sense of absence and an unreliable burial, right? That it makes sense that there would be an obsession with ectoplasm, right? That you would need more than just you need more, right? You would need a sort of a relative to tap you on the shoulder, right? Or to speak with that relative again. And spiritualism provided this. The other interesting thing that spiritualism does is doctors paid this, and nurses paid this huge price in the pandemic, right? A lot of them fell sick themselves. There was nothing that they could do for their patients, and they often spread the virus, right, by going from house to house, right? And they knew this, and the contagion guilt was enormous, right? I mean, not just for doctors, but for everyone. I think we can all relate to this sort of haunting fear that you could give the virus, this invisible sort of enemy, to someone you love or to a stranger. And so you have a way where Arthur Conan Doyle is trying to use all of these scientific methods, and he writes a book called The Land of Mist, right, which is about about spiritualism, and it includes a doctor who is a spiritualist doctor from the other side, who comes and he's able to cure his patients from in these miraculous ways, right? So it's a sort of fantasy in all sorts of directions that was extraordinarily important for people at the time. All right, so on the other end of the spectrum, though, we have zombies. All right, so lots of different ways to become a zombie. And so in one or two words, if you go to the poll and your favorite way of becoming a zombie, give it a try. You guys have been great on the polls too. Thank you. This is the last one, actually. All right, let's see. Yes, right. Bitten, bite, wounds. Yes, infection. Rabies, infectious. In the 1920s, it's great. Bitten, bites, infection, airborne. Yes. All right, let's take a look. H.P. Lovecraft. I should probably confess, not a fan. Had to read a lot of H.P. Lovecraft. So in the 1920s, before actually the term zombie comes out of Haiti, and it's not introduced in the United States and in Europe until the 1920s. Until 1929, 1930s. So the zombies I'm talking about they're not they're not named zombies, but they have a lot of the characteristics that we associate with zombies. And the zombies that come out initially of this in the 1930s are actually a kind of different strain. So zombies are one of those mobile signifiers, right? And every decade needs its own zombie. They mean different things, and they mean different things at different moments. So in the 1920s, you have a bunch of these proto-zombie sort of creatures coming, and I'm going to talk about just one example in the writing of H.P. Lovecraft, who is a horror writer. And one of the things I want to say right up front about H.P. Lovecraft, especially in his writings in the 1920s, though it does extend later, he is a very good example of how all sorts of sort of medical ideas of infection and contagion can morph into racist, homophobic, xenophobic rhetoric. And he's right there with them, right? He is, he believed, he really is a racist. He was convinced that the Aryan bloodlines were being polluted by different races and different sort of immigrant groups, and he really sort of, I mean, and he's using all of these kind of metaphors of infection that link to zombies, and that suggest the way that we are certainly seeing now. We certainly saw it in World War II. I mean, the Nazis very famously were using these disease metaphors, right, as a way of justifying genocide, right? It's a cancer, it's an infection, it's a contagion, and you see that in the works of Lovecraft. So in one of his short stories, Herbert West, Reanimator, he publishes it in 6 installments in 1922 in a magazine called Homebrew. And if you haven't read it, honestly, I can't recommend it, but it is about a doctor and his narrator sidekick. And this doctor is obsessed with bringing back the dead. And he does all of these sort of scientific experiments, and so he needs these fresh corpses, and then he injects them, and then they turn into. I mean, he wants to bring them back, but they turn into kind of zombie-like figures where they go raging around. Biting people, eating. They eat people, and they spread right from house to house. So let's look at. Here's a quotation from Herbert West, and it is about a pandemic that comes across. That erupts in the story, and it's a perfect opportunity for Herbert West, who is a doctor, and the narrator is a doctor, and they're overworked. But this is a passage that really, I mean, it's very much over the top, but it is certainly a scene that we recognize. I shall never forget that hideous summer 16 years ago, when, like a noxious affright from the halls of Iblis, typhoid stalked leeringly through our clime. It is by that satanic scourge that most recall the year, for truly terror brooded with bat wings over the piles of coffins and the tombs of Christchurch Cemetery. The scourge, grinning and lethal from the nightmare caverns of Tartarus, broke with full demonic fury upon the town. Though not as yet fully licensed physicians, we now had our degrees, and we were pressed frantically into public service as the numbers of the stricken grew. The situation was almost past management, and deaths ensued too frequently for the local undertakers fully to handle. Burials without embalming were made in rapid succession, and even the Christchurch Cemetery receiving tomb was crammed with coffins of the unembalmed dead. We were frightfully overworked, and the terrific mental and nervous strain made my friend, this is Herbert West, brood morbidly. And this is very much scenes that describe the influenza pandemic at the time. Here's a quotation from a letter from a gravedigger who was working about 17 miles from where Lovecraft was writing his story, describing the scene in Providence. People died so fast there was barely time to bury them, so they were buried all hours of the day and night without even having services for them. And so then from this, they get this fresh corpse, and this corpse is the corpse of a doctor, and the doctor turns into this zombie figure. And this is a description of that doctor. Through the fevered town had crept a curse, which some said was greater than the plague, and which some whispered was the embodied demon soul of the plague itself. 8 houses were entered by a nameless thing which strewed red death in its wake. In all, 17 maimed and shapeless remnants of bodies were left behind by the voiceless, sadistic monster that crept abroad. It had not left behind quite all that it had attacked, for sometimes it had been hungry. So here we have a pretty useful monster. Monsters are always, I think, embodiments of various terrors, and often, strangely, consolations of sorts. This was a way to visualize a threat. One of the haunting things I think about COVID, and certainly about the influenza pandemic, is suddenly the enemy was invisible. It was in the air, literally in the air, a miasma, right, everywhere, but also nowhere. And zombies, right, this is a way to see it. Right, here's the threat. Here's the threat that is leaving all of these corpses and bloody corpses and flesh that's been wasted away. Here's the reason, right? It's not a virus we can't see, right? It's this zombie figure, and then there's a way to stop it, right? What they do with this doctor is they lock him up, right? They lock him up and they don't let him out, right? And we all know, sort of, probably at this point, sort of how you're supposed to kill zombies. And the point is that there's a way to do it, right? Because you can see it. Woven into the story is also, I think, to get to the theme of rage, right, is this sort of sense of fury at doctors who had spread the virus from house to house. Though also there was an enormous amount of courage that it took for doctors and nurses to go out and treat a disease that they did not have any cure for. And this was also a way to wish that the dead would not return. So a kind of opposite of what we see happening with seances. Here was comfort in the fact that the dead were gone. And you would not wish them back. Lovecraft hated spiritualism, and for those who could not find comfort in spiritualism, a sort of sense that if the dead could come back, it would be terrible. They'd be angry with us. They would want to eat us. They would want to infect us, so maybe it's best, right, that they are in their graves. And I think that this sort of brings us to sort of our own moment. How I think that there's an enormous task ahead of us. How is it that we are going to cope in the years to come with the amount of losses that we have had? How do we adjust to life again? How do we come to terms with it? I think most of us have been to Zoom funerals. Many of us have lost people through COVID, or lost a year with people who didn't have a year left, or caught COVID ourselves, right? How do we move past this, right? Or where do we find consolation? And I would hold out the humanities, right, and the arts in particular, as the way that both producing art and consuming it are some of the best ways that we know to tell stories about what happened, to represent what's happened, and to find what meaning there is to find in what's happened. So thanks so much. Happy to go to questions now.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was terrific. Yes, we'll have digital applause. I hope. I know you can't hear it, but it's echoing through the ether, I suppose.
That's right.
And we had a very lively chat conversation that was going on throughout your talk. So I'm grateful for that. We've tried to gather together some of the comments and questions here. There's a lot to say and to think about, I think. So I'm just going to get straight to it because we do have a hard stop time here of 8:30. So we have just a few minutes here for some questions.
Sorry, yeah.
So I'll pause and ask all of you if you have some questions to please put them in the chat and we'll try to get to them as quickly as we can here this evening. And I thought I'd start with something that Fiore Gray just asked. She said, I wonder if the zombie figure also spoke to people at this time, not only because of the direct metaphor of infection, but also because of the tremendous fears of losing control that must have felt ever present. These catastrophes that were so much bigger than anyone could control, like war and pandemic, just like the zombie loses self-control. Do you want to say anything about that,
Yes,
Elizabeth?
exactly. I think that it's very much a metaphor of that, right? All of the and all of the different ways people lost control, right? Lost control within their own bodies in this kind of viral storm, lost control in the kind of aftermath of PTSD in both war and flu, where people could erupt, right, in rages and violence, and the sense that there was no cure, right, and there was no safety. No learning by heart the ways of the world, right? As Virginia Woolf says, and so I think that the zombies both represent that loss of control, give you a reason for that loss of control, and also give you a sort of way that you might sort of kill off that monster as well, and potentially regain control. So yes, I think it's a great point.
And do most of the zombie narratives like this that you're talking about, do they tend to end with the monster being killed or conquered or put back under control? Is that a part of the story that they tell, is the overcoming of the monster?
Sometimes. So Herbert West, actually, they all come back. All of the monsters that he's created at the end come back. They, I think, crawl through I guess they come to his front door, and then they pull him into a graveyard that is obviously like in his basement, buried on the other side of the wall, and they drag him in there. But they're not seen again. Because the wall is built back up. So I would say yes, in general, in the stories, there's a decisive ending to the zombies. They're killed, and I think that was probably pretty comforting.
Yeah.
Yeah, they come through the walls, but yeah, and terrible. Yeah.
So Nathan asked a bit earlier, and a couple of other people have have echoed this question. So I want to read it. It says, at the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that this flu suddenly just seemed to disappear. What are some of the leading theories as to how and why that happened? And you might also say something about how people then responded to us, and responded to that fact, and maybe what that tells us about how, to return to the theme that you began with, how the flu seemed to have just been so immediately forgotten. That there's tons and tons of public mourning for the war dead, and we just kind of forgot so many more people that died from the flu.
It's really true. So I think that I'm doctor, not a scientist, but it does. I've learned too much about viruses, but the flu virus is drifts an enormous amount, right? It is a virus that this is why you have to get a new flu shot every year, right? Because there's so many variants, and so sometimes, as we see that we have viruses that they get more dangerous, but sometimes they get less dangerous, and sometimes viruses burn out the available sort of hosts, and so the thought is that tons of people sort of finally had immunity to this particular strain of the virus. But it was a very, very new sort of variant of the flu, which is why so many people did not have any kind of immunity to this, which is part of the reason it was so bad. But that's one of the reasons both immunity from people burning out their hosts and potentially drifting into a less virulent form. So we still have that strain of influenza H1N1, but it's just not as deadly. And then there's this perfect storm of silence as to why we forget the flu. Some of it is the war. People were already just beyond ready for it to cease. And in many areas, it was not forgotten, right? So Nigeria, for example, less involved in the war, and it's central to the culture. It was central to the culture. In fact, there's an age, the way that they mark ages for a time was based around the influenza pandemic and how old you were when that happened. So it is different in different parts of the world, but in the countries that had spent a lot of time fighting World War I, by and large, it does seem to disappear from, in part because of the war, and a whole range of reasons around the war, and in part because the flu, it was an ordinary illness, right? There was no structure of sacrifice you could build around it. This was not a masculine, public, history-making war, right? This was a kind of seemingly feminized, right? Just like you couldn't survive the flu. What was the matter with you, right? And so this is why people lie about having died, their relatives dying in the war rather than the flu. And I think it also has to do with grief, right? That you could say my son died, but it was because it was to make the world a more a safer place, right, or what have you. Can't do that, right? Can't do that with the flu. There's no structure. It's just random, amoral. There's a lot more, but those are some of the big ones, right? The war and its timing, and disease and the way we remember disease versus a war.
And as you said, I think that gender component is really fascinating here. I think we heard it in that clip that you played from Doyle, of sort of those happy young chaps. And I mean, he sort of conflated what his son had died from, even in his own memory. It was clearly just as important that his son was among the war dead, not among the flu dead.
Absolutely.
So here's a question from Jessica. She writes, even though 100, and there are many questions that ask you to sort of speculate about this, as I'm sure you get often when you give this talk about comparing 100 years ago to today. So even though 100 years have passed, can you speak to the similarities to the 1918 pandemic and spiritualism and the resurgence of conspiracy theories today?
Yes.
Are there dangers and insights that we might be able to learn, people looking to them as a way to gain a sense of control when one feels like there is no control?
I think that's a great link between the sort of zombies and conspiracy theories, and I do think it has to do with control. Yes, so I see in a kind of eerie way, and also in a kind of comforting way, that so many of the sort of images and metaphors from the flu literature that I studied are things that resonate really profoundly today. The paradigm shifts, right, that are in the literature. The way that unless you can change your reality really, really fast, right, you may not survive. And so you have Catherine Ann Porter's Pale Horse, Pale Rider, where you have this main couple, and they know that the soldier part of the main couple, they know he's going to die in the war, right? Because that's how men die at the time. And so they are going to theaters and to bars, and they're kissing and sharing cigarettes and all of these things at the same time that the flu virus, right? There's all these funerals, right, everywhere, but they're just walking right past them. And he ends up dying of the flu, and she ends up almost dying of the flu, right? So we can be thinking we are in danger of one thing, and totally miss what is actually unfolding. And we see this, right? We see COVID patients dying, denying that COVID is a thing. And so some of the similarities here, and some of what we can learn from the literature is survival depends on being able to shift your reality paradigm quickly, and also while also acknowledging how difficult it is to do that. I think that if we all remember what it was like last March in this country, right? That every sort of 3 days, it felt like there was some sort of new thing, and we still don't know quite where we are in the story. This sense of a kind of anxiety that hangs in the air, right? That is everywhere, and I think the aftermath of an airborne or an air assault, at least, virus. Things that that could help us prepare. We knew this was coming, right? And I mean, I hate to say it, but there is not some rule, right, that that this is our one pandemic for the century, right? We continually forget pandemics, right? Like AIDS, HIV pandemic is still ongoing, right? You have 40 million people dead, right, in that pandemic. You have 50 to 100 million people dead in the influenza pandemic. These are pretty recent, and we're not remembering it. So we think we're going to remember COVID, and I hope we will, but we need to remember it and act on it, right? There are pretty basic things, right, that we can do that would help us prepare for the next pandemic and help it from getting out of hand. And so I think that a lot of the literature is also a big warning. Got to do this, and got to do this work now. It can't wait. So those are just some quick things. There's a very, very long list of that, but it's really very, very moving. Oh, one more: contagion guilt. It's all over the literature, and I think that this is something that is haunting a lot of people. It's certainly haunting me. This thought that you could give a deadly virus to somebody that you love, with not even knowing that you have it, and that kind of that guilt is extremely hard to address. And we see it all over the flu literature. Yeah, so that can maybe help us remember to stay at home.
Well, let me ask you about a difference between 1918 and now. And you mentioned this at the start of your talk as well, which is that they didn't know what a virus was, right? They thought it was a bacteria. And I think, from the very beginning, we knew this was a virus. We have some sense about what a virus is, and thus this hope that this vaccine was on the horizon for us. I wonder if you could talk about maybe the sense of mystery around the illness and maybe the way in which we might see this. We've got several questions that ask how this filters out into things like early film or painting or other kinds of visual art that you didn't discuss in your talk. But I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that, both about the general sense of we don't even know what this thing is. We can't quite theorize it. We don't have a name for virus, and how that sense of mystery maybe filters out into some of the works that you've looked at.
Yes. There's some amazing paintings by Edvard Munch, who caught the flu, and he has these two really haunting paintings that are Scream-like, and of a sort of self-portrait after the Spanish flu. And so much of that kind of blurriness, that kind of surreal landscape, you can sort of see the feverish quality that is built into the brush strokes with that. But yes, I do think that this sort of sense of mystery as to where it came from, and then also the sense of invisibility, which I just think is so critical, and this sort of sense then that everything was unraveling, right? Everything was coming apart, and we get a lot of modernist style was well established before the war and the pandemic. So it's not causative necessarily, but it is an extremely good way. The kind of fragmentation that we see in modernist poetry and novels, a kind of way that sort of sentences might be truncated or might flow into each other. That sense of not quite knowing where you are or what kind of character you are or where you are in a story, like a sense of plot kind of unraveling. All of these things were incredibly helpful, I think, and powerful representations of that kind of mystery and the chaos that we were talking about earlier, that gets sort of infused into virus-like, into the very prose and the structure of the literature, the structure of the structure of some of the painting. I talk in the book about Abel Gantz's J'accuse, his famous World War I film, and the Return of the Dead scene, and the way that links obviously to World War I, but also in a range of hidden ways to the pandemic, right? That the pandemic is hidden in that Return of the Dead scene in these really, really profound ways. But so it's represented, but what is also represented is the mystery of it, right? And the hidden quality of it. And that's what comes through in the art, right? That they both evoke the flu, and they also evoke the way it was hidden and forgotten.
Well, we've hit 8:30, so unfortunately, I think we need to bring things to a close. You've given us so much, and you've certainly got me now. I'll be on the lookout for all kinds of monster movies and things that are going to flow in the wake of our own pandemic.
Yes.
And where we see things like spirit photography return again, and seances. And I mean, I certainly see, even in my own kids, a sort of new interest in astrology, for example, this
Yes.
kind of fascination with the idea of things being out of your control and hidden systems that we might be able to uncover. So, this has been a phenomenal talk. It was, as somebody noted in the comments, extremely well researched and wide ranging, and gave us so much stuff to look at from the early 20th century that spoke really profoundly, I think, to the early 21st century here as well. So I'm grateful. I think it's phenomenal. I want to remind everybody who's here to pick up a copy maybe of Viral Modernism, Elizabeth's book, The Influenza Pandemic and Interwar Literature, where you'll be able to see how she expands on these ideas in really rich and compelling ways. So as we bring the evening to a close, as I said at the start, I would love to have everyone, if you're open to it, go ahead and turn on your cameras here for just a moment so we can actually give Elizabeth some live applause. It's nice to know that there are actually people on the screen that she's been speaking to all night. It's welcome to all of us. So please take a moment, share your applause with Jennifer. It's a pleasure to have you all here with us this evening, and I hope we'll be able to see you at future Humanities Sense events as well. Again, you can find more information about everything we do at the center at humanities.utulsa.edu. So Elizabeth, thank you, and I will now join everyone else with this round of digital applause for you.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for participating in all of those polls. You all have a good night, and stay safe out there.
Thank you very much.